You're listening to Beyond the Sermon, the podcast of First Methodist Church in Collingswood, New Jersey. On our podcast, the goal is not just to share our sermons, but to go beyond the sermon and talk about what we're learning and what God is doing in us and in our community. The conversation you're about to join was inspired by our Fall 2024 series, A Heart Like His, Seeing the Heart of God in the Life of David. In this series, we're asking the question, what does it look like for us to be a people after God's own heart? You can find more information about our church at fumccollingswood.org. Thanks for joining us for this conversation. Well, welcome back. Thanks for joining us this week on Beyond the Sermon. Week and a half ago in my sermon, I shared with the congregation about how an opportunity presented itself and I had to pray through and try to see what God was saying, and God sent a very unique sign in the form of a hawk on top of our church building for multiple days. And through that, God very clearly spoke to me about, staying here at Collingswood, being here, investing in the congregation here. And so then on the podcast, we talked in the conversation a little bit about what it looks like to listen to God, to hear his voice, to discern where and how God is shepherding us, because he is a God who has the heart of a shepherd. And so, Jeremy, over the last year, God's been speaking some things to you about your future and ministry and what he is doing in and through you. So where would you start that story?
Yeah, when you say a year, it makes it sound...
As this podcast airs, we are at New Room Conference again.
Yeah. So last year at New Room, Scott, Meg, Rebecca, and I all got to attend. It was amazing, beautiful. I think we talked about it on the podcast. You can go way back when to hear about that. But the part that was left out of our conversations, at least publicly, were that Rebecca and I felt led and called for me to go to seminary full-time, Asbury Seminary in Wilmore, Kentucky. And that's a whole wrestling thing within those couple of days while we were there, and different signs and God speaking to each of us separately. And I never anticipated or even thought of the idea of going to seminary full-time in person. I'd always imagined if I did, it would be part-time and online. And so we weren't given a specific timeline, that we had like a general idea of when. And we're like, okay, well, God will, as we keep praying and going through ministry, like he'll give us the time in which he wants us to move on. And for those that know Rebecca well, her family does not move more than 15 minutes from the nest, and we are the farthest from my in-laws. And I took her away to the city, is what they said when we first moved to Barnesboro. With just
When you moved to Barnesboro,
yeah, literally
the city.
Yeah, so every time I drove my nieces and nephews up to visit us, be like, where do we live? The burbs, and because they're down in the Pine Barrens, and so that was one thing. And then for me, I'm very much a foodie, culture person, and I do not see that being readily available in Wilmore, Kentucky.
It is not a food mecca, that is for sure.
Yeah, and I don't think Lexington is either, and that's the closest city. So I was like, I'm going to have to drive Nashville every weekend, like 5 hours just to get some food. Anyway, but we were at peace with where God was leading us and trusted him that it would all be good. And even as we started to realize all the logistics of moving toddlers to 10 plus hours away,
Tell me about it, man.
all the things, but we still felt peaceful and confident about it. And so fast forward all the way to youth mission trip this year. And one day we are at the food bank, as you heard about a couple weeks ago, and I get a phone call from a random number, and I answer it, and it is a lovely couple that was at my home church at Pittman UMC. And I don't know if I've mentioned her on the podcast or not, but she would be more famously known as the Candy Lady, because during Sunday school, she had a basket of candy that she went around to each classroom, and every kid got to pick a piece of candy. Anyway, she essentially told me about how they're snowbirds now. They go down to Florida during the winters, and started attending this church. And there was an opening at this church, and she thought of me immediately, and thought all these wonderful things lined up. They have a Spanish congregation there. I know we do too, but like it's officially a part of their church. It's not just utilizing the building. Yeah, a whole plethora of things. And then she was like, but I didn't want to bother you. It seems like you're doing great in your context. But then the Spirit just kept pushing that, like, I'd be unfaithful to God if I didn't tell you about it. And I was like, okay.
That puts a little weight on you, right?
1,000%. It's not dreaming. No woman's dreaming about me.
No woman's dreaming about me either. Don't worry.
But it adds a little weight, and, I get offers or reached out to every once in a while about ministry opportunities, specifically in our area. And, I never want to say no to what God may have for me, so I always pray, Rebecca and I, and within a couple days, it's usually very clear that there's nothing there. But with this, I didn't really have too much time to think and pray about it, because I was leading a bunch of rambunctious young people from 7 a.m. to 11 p.m. every single day. And so I just forwarded it to Rebecca and said, hey, look at this church. And she was like, for what? And I was just like, just look at it if it looks good. And it wasn't until after the kids went to bed that night that I went to where they were storing all the food for the week to just start Googling the church, looking at sermons, looking at their vision. They're a global Methodist church. Found out where they are. They're north of Naples or whatever. And so just kind of wrestling, why am I constantly thinking about it? And doing that through the week, and then through the youth week, how great our kids are. And then I feel like I'm cheating behind their backs by just thinking about this other church. And then one of the kids was talking to a youth from another church and was saying how I prayed for someone like Jeremy, and then he came, and I'm feeling just so guilty. If you only knew, I was on another church's website last night for an hour. And so I get home, Rebecca and I just start praying and praying and praying and praying. And I looked at the job description. I was like, this is not me. This is almost everything I don't like about ministry or don't do well naturally in ministry. It's a lot of the behind the scenes office administrative stuff, organizing, planning.
So why didn't you just stop there? When you looked at the job description, you said, this doesn't really seem like me.
Because I trusted and trust that God, if it's where God wanted me, he would provide whatever's needed. Even if it's the stuff I'm not naturally good at, nor do I enjoy doing, that he would provide. And so I was like, they'd be stupid to even want to hire me, because I'm going to tell them I don't like that stuff. I'm going to tell, but I also know with ministry that job descriptions, it's usually everything that you may ever be asked to do. And it's not always reflective of the daily aspects of the ministry.
Plus other duties as assigned.
But yeah, so we're praying, and I'm like, I don't feel called to this. We don't feel called to this. But I do feel a tugging to get more information and to apply. I think they'd be stupid to accept me. And even if they were to offer me a job, that doesn't mean that we're going. It's just I'm constantly feeling tugged. Every single time we pray, just this tugging of find out more, apply. And so I got in contact with the lead pastor. We had a lovely hour-long phone call. I asked what the job was, and basically they were like, you'd be great. And then I was like, here are my questions for you. Turns out they're amazing and great, not just the pastor, but also the congregation, what God is doing there. And at the end of the phone call, I was like, darn it. Rebecca, there was no red flag. I was hoping for a red flag somewhere in this hour-long conversation that would make me think like, okay, well, I was faithful in getting more information.
But God's clearly closing this door.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And so nothing happened. And then they wanted my resume, sent my resume. They sent personality tests, well, more like a leadership and giftings test, which I complained about and was like, this is a dumb test. This is what I told the lead pastor. This is a dumb test because it was like, are you more one way or the other? And in my mind, most of the questions were not like opposed to each other or like you couldn't be both. So I did that. And then they're like, oh, well, we loved your results. And I jokingly sent back, I was like, well, then I love the quiz in that case. And so while I was in Mexico, again, that whole week, the whole VBS week, I'm at church and I'm seeing people. I was like, if they only knew what I was doing. And the guilt, especially because they were looking to have someone come down in September, October, which would be now. I had a Zoom interview while I was in Mexico. Lovely people, asked great questions. I did not prepare at all. I literally forgot about it until 30 minutes before. Then I started sweating. And then they asked me basic questions like, what are your strengths and weaknesses? And I just froze because I was like, I wasn't expecting that, but I also don't know what I was expecting. Anyway, they asked a lot of really good questions that implied that they understood what the role fully meant. It wasn't just a list of tasks. It wasn't just, I want our church to look like this and I want you to make it look like this. They understood the spiritual aspect, the us giving up our life up here to go down aspect, like, which was all good things when you're applying for a ministry job. So again, no big red flags. And I even asked staff and lay people, why do you believe in the ministry of this specific church? Yeah. And they gave glowing things that were lovely to hear. And then I was mad because there's red flags again. So I get done that. I go to church that night because we had church every day of the week in Mexico that week. And the new pastor preaches about how God took him out of context that he was comfortable in and grew up in and sent him to new places. And he just always wanted to be faithful to where God was leading and that God would provide wherever he was going.
Not helpful, pastor in Mexico.
Not helpful because, to be fair, my Spanish and especially my Christianese Spanish are much later in my life that I was able to pay attention in church because I could understand more, but I couldn't remember a single sermon like that in Mexico the entire time I've been there. And I was like, is this a sign in that direction? Like, every single day was me in my head trying to figure out, if it's not for me to go there, how could God possibly use this for good? Or why is this happening if it's not for me to go there? And I'm going through like every single biblical example of like Abraham and Isaac, of like, does God just want me to put Collingswood on the altar? Not to take it away, but just to know that I'd be willing to give up this congregation that I love so dearly. And through this process, I was like, most people would be happy with Florida, and I love wearing shorts, so that's me all year round anyway, and other aspects. And so I started to navigate for the first time in my life, like, if I could do ministry anywhere in the country, I would want to be here. I would want to be here. Like, yes, in this general area, but I don't know of any congregation in this general area that has
me.
Yeah. If only we were doing video podcasts so you could see my facial reaction. But the congregation, the families that we serve, what God is doing in and through this congregation, even through tough trials, it's where I would want to be. And I've always been very grateful for this congregation. And this just kind of took it to a whole nother level that I didn't know possible. Which is great, because then even on frustrating days when you don't have air conditioning or whatever it might be, or you can't sit a certain amount of people in the great room for fire reasons, that it's all worth it and God's still working through all of it. Yeah, so the next day I go to church again, and it's the velada, which is typically a 6-hour service. Oof. Of worship, pray, preach, worship, pray, devotional, it's scripture and constant rotation. So I go there, and someone that I intentionally sat next to, who I know hasn't been to church much, about an hour and a half through, I was like, hey, do you want to get quesadillas? Because in a velada, you're allowed to kind of come and go as you like. You're not going to be in trouble for leaving at any point. And they were like, well, church is about to be over. And I said, no, it's a velada tonight. And their eyes got big, and they're like, yeah, we can go eat quesadillas. So we went, we ate. God worked within that conversation. I got them home, went back to church, and I arrived mid-sermon, and I wasn't picking up all of the Christianese in Spanish. And so I was like, you know what, this is just a good time for me to just pray, and let me pray about this situation. And so start praying. I don't know, 10, 15, 20 minutes go by, and it all clicks like a divine, I call it like a divine revelation. And that's the thing where I was trying to clarify you with last week's podcast of, how people, especially outside of the faith, could say, well, you just had a new idea, or this is, it's coincidence or whatever. It's not necessarily God. But virtually everything that I had in my divine revelation, I had thought through as a possibility and could have easily nailed it down as being the reason in my head. But it wasn't until talking with God, and like you said before, one of the wisest things Scott gave me was, I know the question you're asking, but what question does he want you to ask? And so I kept asking about this job in Florida instead of like, what do you want for the ministries I'm in charge of here, now, in the future? And this whole process was to help my ministries, the ministries that I'm involved with now, in multiple areas. So I'm praying, divine revelation, everything clicks. Like, it's literally went from 3 weeks of tension in my body and mind to completely at peace. And I'm like, everything's lining up. Oh, and also right before I left for Mexico, something happened in ministry here where Scott and I were talking about the whole, how does this affect the seminary timeline and going to Asbury and all of those things? And he was like, well, what if, if this isn't changing the date of that, what if you're supposed to do online like originally planned? And something happened in ministry here. And I was like, seminary can't prepare you for that. And so I think I'd be better in a place where I can learn from both, of in ministry and in seminary. The click of, us being comfortable and confident in that piece about going to Kentucky, a place much less alluring than Florida, was to help Rebecca and I know what it's like to be confident in where God wants to send us and call us, so that we could contrast that with this questioning and possible opportunity in Florida. So there's that piece of the puzzle, but also kind of push, like, get me more excited for education, for continuing my education. The type of job, right? That whole job description that I didn't think I would like or be able to do, or any of those things. Twofold made me feel more confident that I could do seminary part-time while doing full-time ministry online, where before it was like, that's a lot on my plate. I got 2 young kids. I got this, how is that even going to be possible? But then I was able to convince myself that God could provide me to do the least alluring things for me in ministry as my full-time job in Florida, but I couldn't trust him, or didn't want to trust him, or whatever it might be, that he could help me do seminary as well. And then also getting me more excited for my current position, where that isn't all of what my job is made up of. And that's only a small portion. So I still need to give a little more excitement towards that area, because it's important and helps the rest of the amazing parts of ministry function, but it's still very important, and I can't be as begrudging towards it, because it could have been my entire job. And then lastly, I'm a very loyal person, I guess would be the term. Very loyal person. And so the depths of guilt I felt just considering another position somewhere else, not only towards this congregation that would then be abandoned within a couple months, potentially for my family, taking my sons away from all the community that they have in the church, my in-laws, my friends in the area, whatever it might be, my side of the family. But then also, you know, taking my wife out of her context, that she's grown up in Jersey. She's a Jersey girl through and through. And so to do all of that, though we would, right, if that's where God was leading us to,
Sure.
we'd be faithful. But to take that guilt away, and then thinking of various areas in ministry here that I feel called and led to do, like seminary online part-time, that normally I would feel guilty that it would be pulling away from other areas.
Mhm.
But if it's what God wants me to do, I don't need to feel that guilt for doing what he wants me to do. And then so kind of like having that stark contrast of, you know, if I'm doing online seminary and one night Theo wants to, I don't know, go cannonballing off the bridge in Newton Lake Park. If he wants to do that, and I was like, no, I have to study, and I feel really bad in that moment, to be able to hearken back on, well, I could have dragged him completely away from everyone and everything he's ever known to Florida for life. And so even though it's a couple of hours or whatever it might be that I feel a little guilty about, it's not completely altering his life. And I can apply that to how it affects ministry, how it affects me. And then the most fruitful thing I would say it's done so far, in addition to all of those things and preparing me for things to come, is when I was thinking of, I'd feel guilty about new things taking away from others. What am I doing and occupying time with that isn't fruitful for anything? That's not fruitful for me. It's not fruitful for my family. It's not fruitful for the ministry. And so I've been filtering out certain habits and things, or trying to, working on it. It's a process, but trying to filter out things of like, oh, my phone says that I spent 3 hours, you know, this week on this app. Maybe 20 minutes of it was fruitful, right? So how can I be better at filtering those things out and maximizing the time that God's given me? I know it's a lot. If you think it's a lot listening to, imagine living.
Moral of the story, or key part of the story, God has reaffirmed your call to be right here
That's what you got at?
in Collingswood.
Oh, yes, 1,000%. So, but you know, this is in no way, I would hate for anyone that's on SPRC listening to this to be like, oh, well, now we gotta keep him for however long, right? Like that, I completely trust God. If you say in 6 months, like, you know, we're moving on, then I completely understand, and I know God will provide where he wants me next. Even if all of this was just to provide more zeal for these next 6 months before you lay me off, I know that God's using it for good and his glory ultimately. And so I don't want this to be, well, he had a divine revelation, so that's a 7-year contract.
No. And it doesn't mean that's God's last word on, you know, your location. Doesn't mean you're going to be here till you leave in a coffin. You know, it's...
Oh, I hope not.
You know, it doesn't mean that God's not going to speak at some other point with some other direction. So, a couple things as you're kind of telling this story that I just kind of want to highlight. An opportunity presented itself, and the first thing you did was pray about it.
Sent it to my wife.
Well, true. I mean, that should be right up there.
But yes, then the opportunity to pray about it, absolutely.
But yeah, you prayed about it. And with that, you invited in trusted people. Like, you didn't presume that you were the only one that God could speak to or through into this situation.
1,000%. And even like new, fresh voices in my life, people that I'd met on that mission trip. Being able to talk to them, but then coming, like, that's one of, I think, Scott's best gifts within like pastoral counseling, or like while being in relationship with a local body, of being able to separate his desires and seeking God's wisdom over a situation, because, you're like, I want you to be here for at least 3 more months. But then being able to like go before God on my behalf and also like provide wisdom and that biblical wisdom, most importantly, because that's the only one worth anything. And yeah, so that is extremely helpful in finding people that can separate those things, especially when the decision could affect them in some way, shape, or form.
Yeah. So you took it to God.
Mm-hmm.
You took it to some other people that you trusted.
Mm-hmm.
You didn't just sit and wait. Like, you did wait. You didn't feel like you had to make a decision the very day you heard about the opportunity. Yeah. But in that waiting, you still did everything you knew to be faithful to God, right? You reached out to the church, you had the conversations, you did the interview, you took the personality test, like all that stuff until God was clear.
Yeah.
And I just think those 3 things are key to highlight,
And within that last part, being honest and true to all parties involved.
Yeah.
That first phone call with the pastor, I told her, I was like, here are all my warnings for you about me. Mm-hmm. And so like listing off all of the bad things from the front, it wasn't if I can word it right, then, maybe that's like, I knew if God wanted to happen, then honesty was key because that's what they were going to get. And so being honest there, being honest through that whole process, like I was telling her, like, I'm still not feeling called by God to this. Told her that from the first phone call, told her that before and after the interview. Mm-hmm. And she was very gracious, graceful, but her name is Grace, which is even funnier. But she really was understanding and also like preferred what God wanted for the situation over their immediate desire. But yeah, those things: praying, trusted wise counsel, biblical counsel, Christian counsel, and taking faithful steps.
Taking faithful steps,
even if you don't know where they're going to lead. But if you are feeling led in certain steps, and that was the most annoying part. That's why on last week's podcast, you were like, I wish I knew 100 things ahead.
Yeah.
And I was like, I just wanted to know like 2 things ahead. And then it would have made it so much easier. But I needed to go through every day and every moment as he had prepared for me to get the most out of what he wanted me to know.
Last question.
Yeah.
Why do you think this story is important to share with our congregation and our podcast audience now?
I think part of it is on our podcast specifically, we're always trying to show either behind the scenes or testimonies of what God is doing in our congregation and our staff throughout the week that you wouldn't know from just attending on Sunday. And so if you just see me on Sunday and you're not a youth or a young adult or a parent that's coming up to me, like you would just think everything is kind of the same and quid pro quo and whatever it might be. You may not realize how and what God is doing in the behind the scenes. And so to be able to hopefully get excited about that he's still doing things nowadays, right? That he's still revealing himself in new ways and fresh ways, and that he's drawing, hopefully it would be comforting to me, drawing your pastor into deeper prayer, even if it was agonizing prayer, but prayer nonetheless. So that would be one. Part of it is that it's connected with your sermon last week, and we didn't have nearly enough time to talk about it on the podcast last week. But also I think the fresher a testimony is, especially fresher a testimony after you've processed it all and chewed on it all. Not like I prayed, had the revelation, and the next day I'm recording the podcast. Right? We're almost a month out from when it happened. So being able to chew on it, get clarity on it all, which this one was very quick, but maybe I wasn't as good at articulating it right after. And so having it fresh, because then not only do you get probably the fullest picture of it, but you also hear the more authentic emotions and experience that, because it's fresh, like you just heard. So like me telling the Grand Canyon story to one of the first 5 people. I told it 1,000 times within that first month. But like being one of those first 5 people or family member on the phone with my mom, you're going to get way more of a fresher understanding of it than me saying it for the 1,000th time 2-3 years later.
Yeah. It's not the rehearsed version.
Yeah, that you've gone through so many times. And so, especially on an audio format, to be able to hear that. But I didn't think it really had a place or time within a sermon necessarily, potentially a youth lesson, but not a sermon, but still a testimony nonetheless that's important to share. And so I think that's why the here, the now.
Jeremy, thanks for taking time and sharing that testimony with us, because I do think there's something for people to learn as we focus in this fall on the heart of God, and we talked, a couple weeks ago about learning to hear his voice and letting him lead and shepherd. I think the more examples we get, because the way God worked in this situation for you this time looks different than the way he worked in my situation, even though they were happening pretty close to each other. But I'm also excited because it's confirmation to me that God has things he still wants to do here in Collingswood. Yeah. And the team that we've put together here, God still wants to use.
He's put together. Like God had nothing to do with it.
Oh, God had everything. God had everything to do with it. But yeah, the team that God's put together here, I'm excited for the days ahead, even though we don't necessarily know what all of them are going to look like.
Mm-hmm. Amen.
Well, that's our conversation for today. But that doesn't mean the conversation is over. We'd love to hear your thoughts on these topics as well. To ask a question about anything we've discussed in this episode, or to join the conversation, you can head over to fumccollingswood.org/podcast. Thanks for being part of this conversation.